Just the next president. In the wake of Führer's funeral, a heavy air of uncertainty hung over Wolfia. Ruda, now bearing the full mantle of leadership, returned with a resolve that was as unyielding as it was unexpected. He had inherited the weight of the dark legacy Führers had left behind. The generals under his command, seasoned warriors who had fought beside him through countless battles, were not prepared for the drastic shift that Ruda would soon unveil. In the war room, the atmosphere was tense as the generals gathered around the large, intricately detailed map of the continent. Each of them had been summoned on short notice, and they exchanged uneasy glances, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. The door to the room creaked open, and Ruda entered, his expression a mask of steely determination. Without preamble, he addressed the gathered officers. "We will have a small adjustment," Ruda announced, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "After Hyaenia announces its surrender, President Murray must resign. Jus will be the next president of Hyaenia." The room erupted into a cacophony of voices, generals shouting over one another in shock and disbelief. This was not the plan they had been prepared for, not the strategy they had carefully crafted in anticipation of Hyenia's inevitable fall. Appointing Jus, a known assassin and criminal, to such a high office was beyond anything they had expected. General Vanter, a burly and battle-hardened veteran, was the first to voice his concern. "With all due respect, sir," he began, his tone carefully measured, "Jus is a criminal, a murderer. He's the one responsible for the death of President Natsu. How can we trust someone like that to lead a nation, especially one as critical as Hyaenia?" Ruda's eyes narrowed, and he fixed Vanter with a glare that silenced the murmurs around the table. "I am not asking for your opinion, General," Ruda responded coldly. "This is not a debate. This is an order." "But Ruda," General Kasha interjected, her voice filled with concern, "this decision could have serious consequences. The people of Hyaenia will not accept Jus as their leader. They will see him as a puppet of our regime, a symbol of tyranny rather than leadership. We could be sowing the seeds of rebellion." Ruda slammed his hand down on the table with a force that made the entire room jump. The sound echoed ominously in the silence that followed. "Jus will be president," he said, each word laced with finality. "This is not a suggestion, this is a command. My father made a promise to Jus, and I intend to keep it." The mention of Führers silenced any further objections. The generals, who had served under Führers with unwavering loyalty, knew that to defy Ruda now would be to dishonor the memory of the man they had all respected. Even those who harbored doubts understood the gravity of the situation. They were bound by duty, and Ruda's authority was absolute. General Terrace, who had remained silent until now, leaned forward, his brow furrowed in thought. "If this is your decision, sir, then we must consider the logistics. How do we plan to enforce Murray's resignation? The president of Hyaenia will not simply step down because we demand it. There will be resistance, perhaps even from within their own ranks." Ruda nodded, acknowledging the challenge. "We will deliver an ultimatum to President Murray. He will have two choices: resign peacefully and allow Jus to take his place, or face the full might of the guerrillist army. I will not tolerate any defiance." The room fell silent once more, the weight of Ruda's words sinking in. The generals exchanged glances, each of them weighing the consequences of this bold move. While they might not agree with the decision, they understood the power dynamics at play. Ruda was no longer just the son of Führers, he was the leader of the guerrillist empire, and his word was law. General Vanter finally spoke, his voice subdued but resigned. "If this is your order, then we will carry it out. But I fear the repercussions will be severe. Hyaenia will not go quietly, and neither will its people." Ruda met Vanter's gaze, his expression unyielding. "Let them resist if they must," he replied. "But they will learn that defiance comes at a price. Hyenia's future lies in the hands of Jus, and I will see to it that this transition is made, whether by diplomacy or force." With that, the matter was settled. The generals knew that any further argument would be futile. Ruda had made his decision, and now it was their duty to see it through. As the meeting adjourned, the weight of their orders hung heavily over them, each man and woman contemplating the uncertain road ahead. The following day, a carefully worded note was sent to President Yossi of Hyannia. The message was clear and direct: step down from power and allow Jess to take the presidency or face the consequences. The ultimatum was delivered with the full authority of the guerrillist empire, leaving no room for negotiation or compromise. As the note made its way to the halls of Hyannian power, whispers of its contents began to spread through the streets. Fear and uncertainty gripped the population as rumors of the impending regime change circulated. The name Jess, once whispered in fear, now became the focal point of conversations in every home, market, and tavern. The people of Hyannia knew that their future was being decided behind closed doors, and many feared what that future would hold. Back in Wolfia, Ruda's inner circle was not immune to the growing tension. Whispers of dissent began to circulate among his closest advisors, though few dared to voice their concerns openly. The shift in Ruda's leadership was becoming more apparent, a turn toward authoritarianism that left even the most loyal of his followers questioning where his newfound resolve would lead them. Durica, ever watchful, observed the changes in her husband with a mix of concern and resignation. She had seen the toll that Hurus's revelations had taken on Ruda, and she knew that he was grappling with the weight of his father's legacy. But she also saw the hardening of his resolve, the steely determination that had taken root in his heart. Ruda was not just continuing his father's work, he was forging his own path, one that might lead them all into uncharted territory. As Ruda prepared for the next phase of his plan, the tension within his ranks remained palpable. The generals, though obedient, harbored their own doubts about the wisdom of placing Jess in power. But they knew better than to question Ruda openly. The atmosphere was one of quiet resignation, an acceptance that the course had been set and that they must follow it, no matter where it led. And so, the wheels of Ruda's plan were set in motion, each piece falling into place as the fate of Hyannia and the entire continent hung in the balance. In the days that followed, the pressure on President Murray grew as the deadline loomed closer. The decision he faced was a dire one, with no easy way out. And as the tension reached its peak, the world watched with bated breath, waiting to see how the drama in Hyannia would unfold. In the corridors of power, the shadow of tyranny loomed large, a reminder that in the world of guerrillas, power was the only currency that mattered. And Ruda, armed with the lessons of his father and the full force of his empire, was prepared to spend it, no matter the cost. The struggle for Hyannia's soul. President Murray of Hyannia sat at the head of the long conference table, his face lined with exhaustion and worry. The note from the guerrillist regime lay in front of him, its words a stark reminder of the impossible decision he now faced. The demand was clear: surrender the presidency to Jess, a man known for his ruthless past, or face the full might of the guerrillist military. The ultimatum was non-negotiable, and the weight of it bore heavily on Murray's shoulders. The room was filled with the most senior members of Hyannia's government, each of them representing a different faction within the administration. The atmosphere was tense, the air thick with unspoken fears and mounting anxiety. Murray knew that this meeting would determine the future of their nation, and the stakes could not be higher. "Let's get straight to it," Murray began, his voice betraying the fatigue that had become his constant companion. "We've all seen the note. Guerrillas demands we hand over power to Jess, or they'll bring war to our doorstep. I need to hear your thoughts, now." The first to speak was Minister Lurian, the Minister of Defense, a stern man with a reputation for his unwavering commitment to Hyannia's sovereignty. His voice was firm, his eyes burning with determination as he addressed the room. "We cannot, under any circumstances, surrender to the likes of Jess," Lurian declared, his voice ringing with conviction. "This man is nothing more than a criminal, a murderer who has no place in any government, let alone ours. If we yield to guerrillists' demands, we lose everything: our integrity, our independence, our very identity as a nation. We must oppose this with every ounce of our strength." Several members of the government nodded in agreement, their expressions hardening as Lurian's words resonated with their own deep-seated beliefs. Lurian represented those in Hyannia's leadership who believed that to give in now would be to betray everything the nation had fought for over the years. Minister of Finance, Selik, however, was less sure. A man of numbers and pragmatism, he remained silent for a moment before carefully choosing his words. Lurian, Selik began cautiously, I understand where you're coming from. But we need to be realistic here. We've seen what happened to Birais. Their defiance led to nothing but ruin. Thousands died, their cities were razed to the ground, and their people now live under guerrillist control anyway. Is it really worth sacrificing our people to take a stand that we know will end in our defeat? The room fell silent as Selik's words hung in the air. The horrors of Birais' downfall were still fresh in everyone's mind, a grim reminder of what might await Hyaenia if they chose to resist. The devastation had been swift and merciless, a clear demonstration of guerrillists' power and the lengths they would go to assert their dominance. Murray looked around the room, seeing the conflict in the eyes of his advisors. Some nodded in agreement with Selik's pragmatism, while others bristled at the thought of capitulation. The tension was palpable, each man and woman in the room grappling with their own internal struggles as they weighed the potential costs of resistance against the unpalatable reality of surrender. Then, from the corner of the room, a voice that had been silent for too long finally spoke up. It was Minister Paltris, the Minister of Internal Affairs, known for his measured approach and careful consideration of all sides of an issue. We need to consider what's best for our people, Paltris said, his voice steady but tinged with sadness. We all know what Jess represents, and none of us want to see him in power. But we have to ask ourselves, what are the alternatives? If we resist, we face the very real possibility of war, and our people will suffer. If we surrender, at least we can avoid that bloodshed. Perhaps, under guerrillist rule, we can find a way to preserve our culture, our way of life, even if it means making concessions. Paltris's words seemed to cast a somber spell over the room. For a moment, the voices that had been so strong, so sure of their positions, faltered. The reality of what they were facing, a choice between two terrible outcomes, was impossible to ignore. Murray listened to the arguments, his heart heavy with the responsibility that lay before him. He had led Hyaenia through turbulent times, had fought to preserve its independence and prosperity. But now, he found himself caught in a nightmare from which there seemed to be no escape. The room was a microcosm of the nation's internal struggle, with each faction representing a different path forward, none of them leading to the ideal future they all wished for. Finally, Murray spoke, his voice quiet but filled with the gravity of the moment. We all know what's at stake here, he began, his gaze sweeping across the room. We've heard the arguments for and against. But I need each of you to understand this, whatever decision we make today will define Hyenia's future for generations. If we fight, it must be because we believe that resistance is worth the cost. If we surrender, it must be because we believe that it will save our people from suffering. This isn't just about us or our pride, it's about the survival of our nation. As Murray finished speaking, the room erupted once more into heated debate. Lurian and his supporters continued to argue passionately for resistance, insisting that Hyenia's honor and independence could not be compromised, no matter the cost. Selik, Paltris, and others who shared their views urged caution, pointing out the futility of resisting an enemy as powerful as guerrillist. But there was also a third group in the room, those who had remained silent throughout the discussion, their faces betraying no emotion. These were the ones who had already made up their minds, who believed that supporting Jess, no matter how distasteful, was the only way to avoid disaster. Minister Elira, who had been Murray's closest confidant for years, finally broke her silence. Mr. President, Elira said, her voice calm and composed, I don't like this any more than you do. But the truth is, we are out of options. The longer we debate, the closer we come to war. Jess is a devil we know, and perhaps we can keep him on a short leash, maintain some influence over him. But if we resist, if we defy guerrillists' demands, we will be crushed. Our people will be the ones to pay the price. Elira's words struck a chord with many in the room, particularly those who had been quietly leaning toward the path of least resistance. The prospect of maintaining some level of control, of avoiding the horrors of war, was undeniably appealing, even if it meant making a deal with a man like Jess. As the arguments raged on, Murray felt the weight of the decision bearing down on him like never before. He could see the toll it was taking on his advisors, each of them wrestling with their own conscience, their own fears. The room was a boiling pot of conflicting emotions, and Murray knew that whatever choice he made, it would not be without consequences. Hours passed, and still, the debate continued, with no clear consensus emerging. Murray could feel his energy draining, his mind struggling to keep up with the relentless pace of the discussion. He had hoped that by bringing his advisors together, he might find some clarity, some path forward that could lead them out of this nightmare. But instead, he found himself more torn than ever. Finally, in the early hours of the morning, Murray called for a break. The room fell silent as he spoke, his voice weary but resolute. "I need time to think," he said simply. "We all do. Let's take a break and reconvene in an hour. Maybe then we can find a way forward." The advisors nodded in agreement, some of them clearly relieved at the prospect of a moment's respite. As they filed out of the room, Murray remained seated, his thoughts a tangled web of uncertainty and fear. He had hoped that his advisors would provide him with a clear direction, but instead, he was faced with the harsh reality that there were no easy answers, no clear path forward. The weight of the decision rested squarely on his shoulders, and he knew that whatever choice he made, it would be a gamble, a roll of the dice that could determine the fate of an entire nation. When the hour passed, the advisors returned to the room, their expressions somber and their minds heavy with the gravity of what lay ahead. Murray looked at each of them in turn, searching their faces for any sign of certainty, any indication that they had reached a consensus. But there was none. With a deep breath, Murray made his decision. It was not the choice he had wanted to make, but it was the only one that seemed to offer even a glimmer of hope for Hyenia's future. "We will hand over power to Jus," Murray said quietly, his voice filled with a resigned determination. "It is not what any of us wanted, but it is the only way to avoid war. Our priority must be the safety and well-being of our people, and if that means making this sacrifice, then so be it." The room remained silent as Murray's words sank in. Lurian looked as if he wanted to protest, but the weariness in his eyes told Murray that even he knew there was no other way. "We will do everything in our power to ensure that Jus does not destroy what we have built," Murray continued. "We will negotiate terms, we will maintain our influence, and we will protect our people. But we cannot fight a war that we cannot win." There was no applause, no cheers of agreement. The decision had been made, but it was a decision that no one in the room took any pride in. As the meeting adjourned, Murray remained seated, his thoughts heavy and his heart filled with a sense of failure. He had done what he believed was necessary, but the cost was high, and the future was uncertain. Outside, the sun was beginning to rise, casting a pale light over the city of Hyenia. It was a new day, but for Murray and his advisors, it felt like the end of an era. The road ahead was fraught with challenges and dangers, and they would need all their strength and resolve to navigate it. But as Murray looked out over the city he had sworn to protect, he knew that whatever the future held, he would face it with courage and determination. He had made his choice, and now he would live with the consequences. Embers of rebellion. The streets of Hyenia were quieter than they had been in years. The bustling marketplaces, once filled with the lively chatter of traders and buyers, were now subdued, the vibrant colors of goods and wares dulled by a pervasive sense of dread. The ascent of Jus to the presidency had cast a long shadow over the nation, and the people of Hyenia, who had once prided themselves on their independence and strength, found themselves cowed under the oppressive weight of their new reality. But in the midst of this darkness, whispers of defiance began to stir. The people of Hyenia, though outwardly subdued, harbored a simmering resentment that burned deep within their hearts. The notion of freedom, once taken for granted, now felt like a distant memory, a dream worth fighting for even in the face of overwhelming odds. In the small town of Ruli, nestled in the foothills far from the capital, a group of locals gathered in a dimly lit cellar beneath an unassuming tavern. This was no ordinary meeting of friends or neighbors. It was a clandestine gathering of Hyenia's fledgling resistance movement, one of many that had sprung up across the country in the wake of Jus' rise to power. At the center of the group stood Dorian, a former soldier who had fought in Hyenia's last major conflict. With his broad shoulders and steely gaze, Dorian commanded respect, but it was his unwavering dedication to the cause that had earned him the loyalty of those who now sat around him. "This can't go on," Dorian began, his voice a low rumble that echoed in the cramped space. "We've already seen what Jess is capable of. He's tearing this country apart, piece by piece. We cannot stand by and let him destroy everything we hold dear." One of the men seated across from him, a blacksmith named Varric, nodded in agreement. "We can't fight him head-on, though. We're outmatched in every way: military, resources, even public support. Most people are too scared to stand up to him." A murmur of agreement rippled through the group. The fear of reprisal was real, and it was a fear that Jess had expertly cultivated since taking power. He had crushed dissent with brutal efficiency, making an example of anyone who dared to challenge his authority. "But that's exactly why we have to act," interjected Elara, a young woman who had once been a scholar at Hyenia's most prestigious university before being forced into hiding due to her outspoken criticism of the regime. "If we wait, if we do nothing, Jess will only grow stronger, and any chance we have of resisting him will disappear." Dorian nodded thoughtfully. "Elara's right. We can't afford to sit idle. But we also need to be smart about this. We need to build our strength, gather allies, and strike when the time is right." Sitting at the far end of the table, an older man named Kodo, who had lived through Hyenia's turbulent past, spoke up. "We need more than just strength and allies. We need to win the hearts and minds of the people. Right now, they're scared, just like Varric said. They think resistance is hopeless. We need to show them that there's still hope, that Jess can be defeated." "How do we do that?" Varric asked, skepticism evident in his voice. "It's not like we can broadcast a message to the entire country." Elara leaned forward, her eyes alight with determination. "We start small. We undermine his authority where we can, disrupt his operations, and spread the word through those we trust. We make sure people know that they're not alone in this, that there are others willing to stand up against him. Once they see that resistance is possible, they'll be more likely to join us." Dorian nodded, a plan forming in his mind. "We'll need to be careful. Just spies are everywhere, and if we're discovered, it'll be the end of us. But if we can coordinate our efforts, hit him where it hurts, we can start turning the tide." The room fell silent as the gravity of their mission set in. They all knew the risks, the potential consequences of their actions. But they also knew that they had no choice. The future of Hyenia depended on them, on their willingness to stand up against tyranny, no matter the cost. After a moment, Dorian spoke again, his voice firm and resolute. "Let's start by gathering intelligence. We need to know Jess' movements, his weaknesses. We'll identify targets that we can hit without drawing too much attention, and we'll work to build support among the people. If we can weaken his grip on the country, even just a little, it'll give us the momentum we need." Varric nodded, his skepticism giving way to resolve. "I can get word to some of the other towns. There are people I trust who would be willing to help." Elara chimed in, "And I'll start working on the communications network. We need to make sure our messages get through without being intercepted." Kodo, the elder statesman of the group, smiled wryly. "Looks like I'll be dusting off some of my old contacts. There are a few folks in the capital who might be willing to lend a hand." With the plan set in motion, the group dispersed, each member with a newfound sense of purpose. The task ahead of them was daunting, but they knew that they were fighting for something greater than themselves, for the freedom of their country, for the future of their children, and for the memory of those who had already fallen in the struggle against oppression. Meanwhile, in the capital city of Kirin, the mood was tense. The people of Hyenia went about their daily lives with a sense of unease, the shadow of Jess' regime looming over them. Public gatherings were sparse, conversations were hushed, and the once vibrant streets now seemed devoid of life. But even in the heart of Jess' power, the seeds of resistance were being sown. In a small workshop on the outskirts of the city, a group of artisans had turned their skills toward a new purpose. Led by a man named Garen, a master craftsman with a sharp mind and a deep love for his country, the group had begun producing small, discreet items, pamphlets, armbands, and symbols of resistance that could be distributed to trusted allies across the city. "This is just the beginning," Garen said, addressing the group as they worked late into the night. "These symbols, these words, they're small, but they carry a message. A message that we will not be broken, that we will not bow to tyranny. And as more people see them, as more people wear them, that message will grow louder." One of the artisans, a young woman named Talia, looked up from her work with a determined expression. "But what if we're caught? Just men are everywhere. They're watching us." Garen met her gaze, his expression grim but resolute. "Then we'll be careful. We'll distribute them in secret, through trusted networks. And if we're caught, we'll stand tall and proud, knowing that we're fighting for something worth dying for." The group fell silent, the weight of Garen's words settling over them. But there was no fear in their eyes, only a steely determination to continue the fight, no matter the cost. As the resistance movement spread across Hyaenia, it took on many forms. In the countryside, farmers and villagers began stockpiling food and supplies, preparing for the possibility of a prolonged struggle. In the cities, workers organized strikes and slowdowns, subtly sabotaging Just's efforts to consolidate his power. In the halls of academia, scholars and students continued to discuss the principles of freedom and democracy in secret, passing on the knowledge and ideals that had once defined Hyenia's identity. Though their voices were muted by fear, they remained committed to the cause, knowing that the power of ideas could be just as potent as any weapon. In the homes and marketplaces, ordinary citizens whispered words of defiance to their neighbors, quietly spreading the word that resistance was possible, that they were not alone in their desire to see Just removed from power. The movement grew slowly, but steadily. It was a movement fueled by the collective will of the people, by their shared belief that Hyenia's spirit could not be crushed, no matter how dark the times had become. In a small apartment in the heart of Kirin, a man named Aiden sat at his kitchen table, surrounded by a group of trusted friends. Aiden had once been a journalist, a man who had dedicated his life to uncovering the truth and holding the powerful accountable. But under Just's regime, the press had been silenced, and Aiden had been forced into hiding. But even in the face of such repression, Aiden had not given up. He had continued his work in secret, gathering information, documenting the injustices of the regime, and finding ways to share the truth with the people of Hyenia. "We need to be smart about this," Aiden said, his voice low and urgent as he addressed the group. "Just has eyes and ears everywhere. If we're going to expose him, we need to be careful, strategic. We can't just come out and say it, not yet. But we can plant the seeds. We can share stories, spread rumors, get people talking." One of Aiden's friends, a young man named Finn, nodded in agreement. "I've been talking to people at the factory. They're all scared, but they're starting to see what's really happening.